Think your life is tough? You wouldn't last a single day in ancient Rome. Forget Netflix and comfy couches. Try bleeding eyes, shared toilet sponges, and stews made from fermented fish guts. Life back then was survival mode every hour. Imagine you're dropped into the year 235 CE, smack in the middle of one of the worst times to be Roman. The place is technically still an empire, but it's got more cracks than a broken amphora. They call it the crisis of the 3rd century, and you're about to learn why that name doesn't even come close to how bad it really was. So what kicked this whole disaster off? Simple. Some soldiers decided they didn't like the emperor. Not uncommon for Rome, but this time it stuck. Emperor Alexander Severus, a young ruler more interested in peace treaties than stabbing people, was assassinated by his own troops. Apparently, choosing diplomacy over battle was the ultimate ick for Roman soldiers. His big mistake? Listening to his mom. Julia Mamaea basically ruled behind the scenes. And the army hated her guts. When she told Alexander to pay off invading Germanic tribes, instead of fighting them, the soldiers were done. Solution? A knife in the neck. Problem solved. Except now, the empire had none of the above. No leader, no plan, no clue. That's when the emperor merry-go-round started spinning. Over the next 50 years, more than 20 different emperors took power, most of them for about as long as it takes you to scroll through Instagram. Historians later gave them a fitting name, the Barracks Emperors, because if you wanted to rule Rome during this time, all you had to do was get the army to like you for 5 minutes. Spoiler, they wouldn't. These weren't elected officials. They were military guys with big muscles, bigger egos, and absolutely zero experience running a country. Imagine choosing your next president based on who could bench press the most. Now imagine they keep getting assassinated in the gym. Let's run through just a few of these gladiator-turned-rulers. Maximus Thrax came first, a huge guy, reportedly over 8 feet tall and strong enough to punch a horse to death. But his personality, not so impressive. His reign was all war, famine, and people getting sick of him. Literally, he got chopped before he even reached Rome. Then there was Gordian I and Gordian II, a father-son duo who ruled for about a month before the son died in battle and the father killed himself. Followed by Balbinus and Pupienus, yes, that's a real name, who their own guards murdered. Gordian III made it a bit longer until he was also assassinated. Philip the Arab came next, who was overthrown by Decius. Then Decius died in battle, and his son died from the plague. Gallus and his son Volusianus got taken out by their own soldiers too. See the pattern? If you were an emperor, your chances of survival were about the same as a goat in a lion pit. And that's before we even talk about the actual crisis. Because while all these guys were busy playing musical thrones, the rest of the empire was falling apart. Civil wars broke out like pimples before prom. Provinces stopped listening to Rome altogether. Foreign enemies saw the chaos and thought, hey, free real estate. And then came the knockoff versions of Rome, the Gallic Empire in the west and the Palmyrene Empire in the east. These weren't just rebellious cities, they were entire regions that said, we're gonna run our own thing now, thanks, but no thanks, Rome. The Gallic Empire, led by a guy named Postumus, took over Gaul, Britannia, Hispania, and parts of Germania, basically everything west of Italy. He even set up his own senate and coins. Think of it as Rome Jr. with daddy issues. Meanwhile, in the east, Queen Zenobia of Palmyra wasn't just sipping wine and watching the chaos. She took over Syria, Egypt, and big chunks of Asia Minor. She even issued coins with the Roman emperor's face on one side and her son's on the other, like a subtle, we're still cool, right? Wink to Rome, except Rome wasn't cool. Rome was broke, bleeding, and barely breathing. Back in the center of the storm, the economy had gone full clown show. The emperors kept debasing the currency, basically mixing the silver in coins with cheaper metals like bronze or lead. It's like watering down your juice so much it just tastes like regret. This led to insane inflation. Your paycheck could buy you a loaf of bread in the morning, but by afternoon might get you a grape if you were lucky. Meanwhile, the military kept growing. Armies got bigger, which meant more soldiers needed more food, more equipment, and more money Rome didn't have. And guess where they pulled those soldiers from? Farms. So now food production was crashing too. Add in a couple of devastating plagues, because of course there were plagues, and things really spiraled. One of the worst was the plague of Cyprien. This wasn't your average cough and sneeze. We're talking vomiting, diarrhea, blindness, gangrene, and straight up body parts falling off. Imagine having a sore throat and suddenly losing your leg. No thanks. At its peak, this plague was killing 5,000 people a day. Entire towns emptied out. Alexandria, one of the biggest cities in the empire, lost over half its population. Not because people moved away, because they died. And just when it seemed like the empire was going to completely snap in half, one guy showed up who actually knew what he was doing. His name was Aurelion. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't rich, but he could fight, and more importantly, he could win. First, he handled the barbarians threatening the borders. Then, he turned around and crushed the Palmyrene Empire. Zenobia? Captured. Her dream of ruling Rome? Over. But Aurelion didn't humiliate her. He actually showed mercy. Probably because he was too tired to do anything dramatic at that point. Then he stomped out the Gallic Empire, whose latest ruler, Tetricus I, basically surrendered without much of a fight. And just like that, Aurelian reunited the Roman Empire. Rome was whole again, but still very broken inside. The economy was still a dumpster fire. The army was still too powerful. Assassins still roamed the halls like unpaid interns with knives. Sure enough, Aurelian didn't even make it to retirement. He was murdered by his own men, who thought he was planning to kill them. Turns out he wasn't. Awkward. So how did Rome finally claw its way out of this nightmare? That credit goes to Diocletian. He took power in 284 CE and said, "All right, enough of this." Then he rolled up his sleeves and rebuilt the system from scratch. He split the empire into two halves, east and west, so it was easier to manage. He created a new leadership model called the tetrarchy, meaning 4 rulers instead of 1, so if one died, and let's be real, they would, there were backups. He even stabilized the currency and passed reforms that stopped the economic freefall, for a while, at least. So yeah, if you thought your boss micromanaging your spreadsheet was annoying, try living in a world where your ruler changes every few months, your money is worthless, your crops are failing, and there's a decent chance your city is either on fire or full of plague zombies. You wouldn't last a day. And don't think you'll be finding comfort in a nice warm meal either, because in Roman times, dinner could mean anything from a gritty bowl of barley mush to a flamingo tongue served on a silver platter, depending on who you were, how much you had, and how much you were willing to chew through. For everyday folks, food meant grains, lots of grains. If you thought oatmeal was boring, try pulse, a sad, watery barley paste that was basically Roman peasant fuel. Add some lentils or chickpeas if you were lucky. Meat? Forget it. That was for special occasions, or if your neighbor's pig wandered a little too close to your yard. Sure, the upper class could splurge. They threw elaborate banquets that included delicacies like sea urchins, jellyfish, and sauces made from fermented fish guts, known affectionately as garum. Think soy sauce if it went feral. Speaking of fish guts, garum wasn't just a side dip, it was in everything. Romans used it like ketchup. Breakfast, add garum. Stew, garum. Dessert, surprise, it's garum again. It was Rome's favorite seasoning, and it smelled exactly how you think it did after fermenting in the sun for months. And if you thought sugar would save you, think again. They didn't have it. Honey was the go-to sweetener, or defrutum, which was grape must boiled down into sticky syrup. Candied treats? Sure, if you had the coin. Otherwise, your sweet tooth just had to deal with a raisin. Now let's talk meat. Yes, Romans ate it, but not the way you imagine. Refrigeration wasn't a thing, so everything had to be cured, smoked, dried, or just consumed fast. Pork was the crowd favorite, and nothing went to waste. Tongue, feet, blood, you name it. Sausages were a whole science project, and depending on where you lived, your province might have had a meat specialty, like the famed hams of Gaul or smoked sausages from Lucania, filled with nuts, herbs, and enough salt to shrivel your insides. Dairy existed, but it was kind of a mess. Goats and sheep did most of the milking, and milk was more useful for making cheese or skincare than for drinking. Cow milk? Seen as gross. Butter? That was barbarian food. Real Romans used olive oil for everything: cooking, bathing, grooming, and probably solving existential crises. In fact, olive oil was such a big deal that entire trade empires were built on it. The best stuff came from central Italy, but Spain and North Africa were oil factories too. Olive oil presses were massive, and the technology behind them was impressive. Butter spoiled in the sun, but oil was eternal. Vegetables and fruit were your saving grace, if you could afford the good stuff. Think cabbages, beets, leeks, cucumbers, and gourds. Fresh fruit included pomegranates, peaches, melons, grapes, apples, cherries, and pears. Dried fruits like figs and dates made good travel snacks, and nuts, almonds, hazelnuts, chestnuts, were everywhere. Truffles and wild mushrooms were foraged too, but let's be real, one wrong mushroom and boom, early funeral. Markets in big cities like Rome were packed with vendors, selling all these items, but again, only if you could pay. Grain prices were a political battlefield, which is where the annona came in, the grain dole that handed out wheat to hundreds of thousands of citizens. By Aurelion's time, they were even getting free bread, pork, wine, and olive oil. Free groceries from the state sounds great, right? Well, it came at a cost. Loyalty and silence. The famous bread and circuses wasn't just a joke, it was a strategy. Now, if you lived in an apartment, and most Romans did, you probably didn't have a kitchen. Maybe a brazier and a prayer. So you ate out, but not at a fancy restaurant. Taverns and street stalls sold hot food out of stone counters. Stews, bread, boiled beans, street food, Rome style. You could eat while standing next to a guy yelling at his donkey. It was atmospheric. Meanwhile, the rich were dining in style, 3-course meals, reclining on couches, being fanned by slaves, while a flamingo breast was carved onto their golden plate. They even had wine mixed with seawater or flavored with wormwood. And yes, Romans mixed their wine with water. Drinking it straight was considered barbaric. Real Romans wanted their alcohol civilized and slightly diluted. Even the army had to be fed. A 40,000-man force with thousands of horses burned through tons of grain every day. Soldiers were issued raw wheat, which they ground themselves and cooked into flatbread or gruel. If that wasn't enough, sutlers, basically ancient food trucks, followed the legions, selling extras like vinegar, wine, or a better cut of goat. But food wasn't just about survival. It was status. The more exotic your dish, the more impressive you looked. That's why emperors like Vitellius went full foodie warlord, creating monstrosities like the Shield of Minerva, a dish featuring flamingo tongues, lamprey guts, and brain pate, supposedly fed to him by an entire fleet. Still hungry? Didn't think so. But before you swear off history forever, remember this. In Rome, food wasn't just sustenance. It was culture, politics, medicine, and a bit of a party trick. Sometimes it could impress guests. Other times, it could send you running to the nearest toilet. And speaking of toilets, hope you're ready. Because in ancient Rome, relieving yourself wasn't a private act. It was practically a group activity. Try sitting elbow to elbow with strangers on a cold marble bench with holes carved into it. That's the Roman toilet. No stalls, no doors, just vibes. And don't expect Charmin. Romans used a communal sea sponge on a stick, lovingly named a tersorium. One stick for everyone, rinsed in a shared water trough. Maybe. You'd better hope Claudius before you was a clean freak, or you're walking out of there with more than just embarrassment. Toilet paper? Never invented. Privacy? Never heard of it. Disease? Yeah, we'll get there. Now here's the wild part. Some Romans actually hung out in these bathrooms for hours, read scrolls, had full conversations, maybe even networked. We even have ancient graffiti about this. There's a poem where a guy spends all day in the latrine, not to go, but because he's broke and fishing for dinner invites. Can't afford supper? Go make friends on the toilet. That's Roman budgeting. But if you didn't like the sound of communal bathrooms, don't worry. You still had to deal with Roman baths. Ah yes, the famous Roman bathhouses. At first glance, these things seem luxurious. Heated floors, hot and cold pools, massage rooms. It sounds like a spa day. But step inside and it's more like a mix between a gym locker room and a splash zone at a kid's water park, except with oil. You'd start by exercising, not for health, but to get sweaty. Then you'd get rubbed down in oil because soap was too barbarian. Next came the strigil, a metal scraping tool that removed the oil, sweat, and dirt. It's like a squeegee for your body, except it could leave gashes if used too hard. Augustus Caesar, he apparently scraped himself so aggressively he ended up with open sores. Self-care, Roman edition. The water never changed. Hundreds of people used the same baths every day. So while Romans loved to wash, the line between clean and marinated got a little blurry. And if someone brought something contagious into the pool, congratulations, now you all have it. And what they caught wasn't just your run-of-the-mill cold. Enter the plague of Cyprien. This was biblical-level horror, the kind that makes modern pandemics look like a sniffle. From around 249 to 262 CE, people across the empire dropped dead at record speeds. In Rome, 5,000 people a day were dying. Alexandria lost more than half its population, and those who didn't die were busy running from everyone who looked even slightly sick. Symptoms were next-level nightmare fuel: vomiting, blindness, deafness, bleeding from the eyes, rotting limbs, and constant diarrhea. Cyprien, the bishop who documented it, described it as the bowels releasing all strength. Translation, you'd poop until you couldn't stand. Not exactly the kind of illness you walk off. This plague didn't care if you were rich, poor, soldier, priest, or emperor. Everyone was a target. Families abandoned their sick. Friends refused to help friends. It got so bad, the dead were left rotting in the streets, and some cities started burning corpses just to keep up. Panic set in, and when panic meets ancient superstition, things get weird. Some Romans blamed the Christians, accusing them of angering the gods. Others believed it was divine punishment for moral decay. Meanwhile, the Christians leaned into it, helping the sick, burying the dead, and preaching about eternal life. And honestly, it worked. Their compassion and bravery earned a lot of respect and even more converts. But the chaos didn't stop there. Rome was still knee-deep in its leadership crisis. The army was short on men. Crops rotted in fields with no one to harvest them. Cities collapsed. Provinces rebelled. And the empire teetered on the edge of total collapse. The plague wasn't just a health crisis, it was a civilization-level stress test, and Rome barely passed. So let's recap. You're using a community toilet with no soap, bathing in water that's seen more skin cells than a dermatologist's microscope, and now everyone around you is dying from a disease that makes your eyes bleed and your legs fall off. But even if you somehow dodge dysentery, dodge the plague, and dodge being scraped raw with a bronze spatula, there's still one more thing waiting to ruin your Roman vacation. Ever try asking for directions in a country where you don't speak the language? Now imagine that times 10, because Latin, it's an entirely different way of thinking. First, you have to forget everything you know about sentence structure. Latin throws verbs at the end of the sentence, sometimes, or not. Depends on the mood. And the case system, it's like your nouns change shape depending on what they're doing. Subject, object, indirect object, all have different endings. Want to say, the dog bites the man? One wrong ending and you've accidentally declared the man bites the dog, and now you're the town lunatic. And don't expect locals to help. You sound like a madman shouting Wingardium Leviosa at the bread vendor while pointing at grapes. You're getting no help, and maybe a punch. Even basic survival becomes a nightmare. Need to find the bathhouse? Good luck explaining that when all you can muster is balneum, aqua, scrape? Need to beg a guard not to arrest you? Hope you conjugated that plea properly, or you're off to the mines for accidentally saying you want to be flogged. In Roman time, language wasn't just a barrier, it was a trap. One bad sentence, and you're not just misunderstood, you're publicly humiliated, or worse, on trial. Remember, their court system ran on confession and spectacle. You say the wrong thing in Latin, they might just assume you're a heretic, a spy, or someone who needs to prove their innocence by carrying a red-hot iron across 9 feet of stone. No pressure. So after all this, are you still thinking you could totally handle ancient Rome? Because unless you're fluent in Latin, immune to hemorrhagic fever, and cool with sharing a sponge with strangers, you wouldn't last a day. And if you somehow, miraculously do survive all of that, well, there's always the Colosseum, where someone might throw you a sword and a wink, and then throw a lion at you.